R9-290.
Welcome to Tech Yes City. This is Brian coming back to you guys today with a review of the Gigabyte R9-290. Now this is an AMD graphics card, and as you can see here, it is one big graphics card. Now, you guys are probably wondering, you haven't tried an AMD graphics card in a while, and yes, I haven't. However, when I saw this thing pop up on Amazon for $255 USD with free shipping, my jaw dropped. I mean, you're getting a flagship card for $250. That's really good value for money. However, I did have to pay a little bit more in shipping and import duties since I do live in Japan. However, it still worked out a lot cheaper than I otherwise could have got this thing domestically for. Anyway, today we'll be having a look at the graphics card. I'll be benchmarking it, talking about how I think it compares to the GTX 970. I'll also be making a separate video comparing this graphics card directly to the GTX 970, as I do believe they're two of the best graphics cards out there at the moment. And I'll also be telling you guys some extra augmented things with the AMD graphics cards. There's still a few little things that I nitpick, however they're not such a huge issue. But anyway, let's get on with the review. So if you've followed me for a while, you know that my history with AMD ATI graphics cards is complex to say the least. I've either had problems with drivers, cards overheating, or cards just simply not overclocking at all. However, I'm pleased to say that this is a different experience, and it has in ways renewed my faith with the AMD ATI graphics section of their company. However, let's look at this card directly at the moment. So this is the 1 kilogram beast. Now this card is actually pretty heavy. It's a lot heavier than my GTX 970 that I have around here. This thing weighs in just over 1 kilogram. So at that weight, it is pretty heavy. It's actually a really solid built card. So looking at the front of the card, we can see here we've got three 80mm fans. They're also, they do a fantastic job of cooling, by the way. They also don't get too noisy, though past about 50% they do start to make a little bit of noise, so be careful there if you hate noise. They've got the steel shroud here. This is actually made of steel, so it's not plastic. I like what Gigabyte have been doing with this lately. As the GTX 670 I had years ago, that actually had a plastic shroud on it. This feels a lot better, gives the card a more solid feel, makes it look better. You've also got this Windforce logo sticking out here, which I personally don't really like a lot. I think the GTX 970 implemented the Windforce logo a lot better than this did. However, looking at the side here, we can see that the shroud extends the side here, and it actually looks cool. We've got an 8-pin and 6-pin connector at the side here. That'll give this card ample power for overclocking if you need to. At the back, we've got the shroud slightly coming over, and this isn't much of a problem. I mean, it is a bit shorter than my GTX 970. This measures in around about 280mm. But let's look at the rear of the card. We feature here no backplate. Personally, I do like the backplates that Gigabyte have been adding to their cards lately. I would like to see a backplate on this card as well. Though backplate or no backplate, it doesn't really bother me too much, as I buy a graphics card for its performance, not its looks. Anyway, looking at the back, it does look pretty cool here. You've just got a mountain of resistors on the back here. It's got a black PCB as well, which actually looks pretty cool. Looking at the rear of the card, we have here two DVI connections here. They're both two DVI-I, dual port connections as well. No DVI-A, which is interesting. So something to be mindful of there. You've also got a display port here, and you've also got a HDMI port here. So connections is pretty good. I'd personally like to see a DVI-A, as I mean, some people might want to overclock this thing and use an analog input. Also, some quick features before we move on to the benchmarks. This card itself, it also has the ability to use AMD's Mantle, and it also has the ability to use AMD's True Audio, so where it processes the audio off the graphics card itself. So anyway, without further ado, let's move on now to the benchmarks. Okay, so let's move on now to the benchmarks, and I'll put my description for my rig in the description below for you guys. It's a 5820K clocked at 4.2 gigs. I'm also running 16 gigabytes of DDR4 memory clocked at 2.4 gigs, and the rest of it's in the description below if you want to check it out. Also, another thing that's actually concerns me about the R9-290 is, before I reviewed this card, I actually spent a long time gaming on it because I wanted to do this review for you guys as best as I could. People were telling me for a long time, try out the R9-290 from a good vendor. And I consider Gigabyte one of the best vendors out there. And something I noticed about the R9-290 was when I initially benched it to when I benched it 2 weeks after using it, it was using, I mean, the benchmark scores were lower. and I just can't get my head around this. Anyway, I'll talk about it a bit more, but let's get on now to the benchmarks that I did before I took it out of my computer, and this was done on a fresh install of Windows as well. So anyway, let's move on now to Battlefield 4 1440p Ultra on the test range here. The GTX 970 scored 110.8 frames per second, and then the R9-290 out of the box scored, or the factory settings, scored 78.56. So it actually got quite a beating in Battlefield 4. Moving on now to Crysis 3 1440p Ultra. Now this time I decided to max out everything. People are like, look man, your Crysis 3 results before probably a little bit high. So I decided to max out everything, and man, does this put a lot of stress on the GPU. The GTX 970 out of the box scored 35.92 average FPS, and the R9-290 scored 29.96. So both of these graphics cards were getting a hammering in Crysis 3. Arma 3, this is mainly a CPU bound game for what it's worth, as if you guys saw my comparison between the 5820K and the 4670K. The 4670K was beating this because it was clocked 400 megahertz higher. So for what it's worth, it's still very CPU bound even at 1440p on Ultra, but it managed to score 73.8 frames per second versus 69.36. And why I'm pointing it out with the CPU bound thing, I'll show you later when I do show you the initial benchmark scores. It doesn't make sense. But anyway, Unigine Valley, Extreme HD preset, the 1080p scores. I've thrown the R9-270 out of the box in there for reference. But you can see here both these cards are in a different caliber to the R9-270, with the R9-290 scoring 2,565 when it was overclocked to 1,089 megahertz. And the RAM, I also managed to get over a gig out of the RAM. So the overclock on this thing, I'll talk about a little bit later too, but it was pretty impressive. The GTX 970 overclocked as well. That scored 2,638. The R9-290 out of the box scored 2,314 versus the GTX 970 out of the box, which scored 2,436. So let's move on now to the Firestrike scores. Everyone loves to do a Firestrike benchmark, and it's for good reason. It's a really GPU-intensive benchmark. So here we have the GTX 970 out of the box scoring 12,200 right on the flat line there, and the R9-290 out of the box scoring 10,498. So both of these cards did really well in Firestrike. Also, the R9-290, when I overclocked it, it scored 11,600. Again, it was weird. It was right flat on 11,600. With the GTX 970 overclocked scoring 13,289. So both these cards did really well in Firestrike. Let's move on now to overclocking with Crysis 3. So this is a bit of an anomaly. I mean, this is pretty funny, but again, this was just such an intensive game on the GPUs. The GTX 970 overclocked managed to score 40.36 as opposed to the R9-290s, which scored 32.04. Moving on now to the GTX 970 out of the box, it scored 35.92 versus that 29.96 which I showed you guys before. So overclocking Battlefield 4, here is another game which is pretty GPU intensive for what it's worth. The GTX 970 overclock scored 120.08 versus the R9-290 overclock, which scored 86.74 average frames per second. So in Battlefield 4 is a clear victory for the GTX 970. Let's move on now to power, noise, and temps. So this is power consumption. This was measured from the wall on a 650 watt bronze Earthwatts power supply, and we can see here that the R9-290 out of the box, this is with the 5820K, which is quite a power consumption beast in terms of CPUs. So it scored 570 watts from the wall. This was in Unigine. I did these scores in Unigine, and the 970 out of the box scored 480. Both these cards on idle were actually really good. They showed really good power consumption on idle, mainly 30 watts over the 4670K. That would be mainly due to the 5820K, but for what it's worth, it used up about an extra 90 watts on load than the GTX 970 did. When I overclocked these, the GTX 970 actually scaled better than the R9-290, with the R9-290 scoring 615 watts from the wall as opposed to the GTX 970, which only went up to 505 watts. Let's move on now to temps. And honestly, with temps, this was done at ambient degrees of around about 15 degrees Celsius. So it was pretty cold in here, but the GTX 970, this was overclocked. I just decided to show you guys the overclocked results. 60 degrees. Overclocked. I mean, the cooler didn't even get hot. This is after gaming sessions as well. The GTX 970, they all run pretty damn cool, and they're not hard to keep under control. The R9-290 was kind of an interesting thing because when I tested this card, in the benchmarks, I mean, it didn't even cap 74 degrees on the temp readings in MSI Afterburner. But one thing I did notice after using this card in heavy gaming sessions after a long time was that the cooler got really hot to touch. And this was something that I wanted to point out because I don't know, AMD, where are they putting their temp sensors? Because, I mean, it was getting like sizzling hot to touch with my finger, but the temps were still reading like around 70 degrees. So I'm kind of scratching my head about the temps there because my GTX 970, if I touch it any time, like in this 15 degrees ambient temps, it's just really cool. I could leave my finger on there all day, every day, and not have to, it's just literally really cool to touch. So the R9-290 after a heavy gaming session, especially in Advanced Warfare, I was testing that out recently, it just got really hot to touch. And so it makes me wonder if AMD are putting their sensors right on the core of their graphics cards. So that's something I'll point out, because if we look at here, the initial benchmarks, this is before I got the graphics card, before I used it for a while. This is when I first installed it. I ran some benchmarks, and as we can see here, this is the R9-290 when I initially got it. It's got 90.48, and now before I did the benchmarks after 2 weeks, I tried everything, reinstalling the drivers, everything like that, to no avail. I installed beta drivers as well. It was getting the same scores. It was getting lower scores than when I initially got it. So I'm kind of wondering what's going on here. Why is it scoring 90.48 out of the box? It's beating its own overclocked settings. So it's something that I'm scratching my head about. Look at Crysis 3. This was when I initially got it, 34.133. It's beating the overclocked scores. Why is that? Same with Armor 3. And now Armor 3 is the most interesting thing because it scored 78.72 on my 4.2 gigs 5820K. And I know this is a CPU-bound game. So I'm kind of wondering what's going on here with the AMD R9-290. It's weird. Like it shouldn't be the graphics card, because I know this game. I overclocked my GTX 970, and I was getting the same results with Armor 3. I wasn't getting any higher scores. So it makes me scratch my head. What's going on with Armor 3? So anyway, that's something I'd like to point out. Another thing that I'll point out before I get to the conclusion is the stuttering. The AMD micro stutter. It's something that it's the reason why I left AMD graphics cards and I went to NVIDIA graphics cards years ago. I'll pull up a simple video here. This is me opening a video on Windows and on the AMD, and this is at 60 frames per second from my camera at 720p. And then I'll run the same video playback on my GTX 970. And you guys can see it for yourself. This is just a simple video because I noticed in some games there was some micro stuttering. Mainly, Heroes of New Earth had it. The AAA titles didn't suffer from this micro stutter. But it's something that concerns me. It's still there to some degree. I mean, AMD have gotten a lot better with their drivers. But it's still there. It's something that does bother me. But anyway, with that being said, there's the two video files. I'll move on now to the conclusion where I'll talk a lot about this graphics card in depth. So, in conclusion, what do I say? For $250 USD, if you can pick an R9-290 up for that price, then it does get recommended. It's a good card. It's just not a great card. And so if you guys have skipped to the conclusion, then I really suggest that you do watch the benchmarks section, because that's where I've explained all the anomalies of this card. But I'll give you guys a quick recap if you didn't. Basically, this card, it ran better for the initial, like when I initially got it, the benchmarks ran better than when I tested it 2 weeks after using it in heavy gaming sessions. So that was something that really made me scratch my head, especially the Armor 3 benchmark, which I know is a CPU-bound game for what it's worth. So something was weird that was going on there. I don't know what it was, but coupled with the fact that there's still that micro stuttering. It still exists, especially in Heroes of New Earth, which is a game I play regularly. It was still there. I mean, I showed you the video where it's just a simple video of me watching a video, my intro, the one that you can no longer see, but it's the initial intro where it sucks in. You can see that it's got a little bit of stutter on the AMD, and on the NVIDIA, absolutely no stutter at all. That's just a simple example. In some games, it has this micro stuttering. It still exists. It's basically a driver problem, because in AAA titles, Warlords of Draenor, and Advanced Warfare, this card ran as smooth as butter on 1440p. It was a really good experience. And so AMD have come a long way since when I used to use them back in 2010. But it's reasons like the micro-stuttering, it's reasons like the 2 weeks lower benchmark scores is the reason why I switched to NVIDIA. And I've never had a problem, not one problem with any NVIDIA graphics card I've used over the past few years. The game, the overclock well, they run cool and quiet. And then there's another thing about this card, and that's even without the overclock settings applied, the card was in Advanced Warfare was getting sizzling hot to touch. Like really damn hot. I was surprised. I was like, what's going on here? This is at like 15 to 18 degrees ambient temps in this room. So this card got sizzling hot. And then the temp readings were like on 60, I think they were just a little bit over 60 degrees, like 64 degrees. So it makes me wonder where AMD are putting the temp sensors on their graphics cards. Are they actually putting them inside the cores, or are they putting them after the cores, sort of right near the cooler? I don't know. I'm not too sure, but it does raise some concerns. Honestly, should you overclock this graphics card? I'd say for 24/7 gaming, no. I'd say where it's at out of the box is probably around the sweet spot. Even in the summer, it'd get probably a bit hotter, so I'd be concerned. But honestly, look, let's look at it in this way. For $250 USD, it gives really good scores. So this is a 1440p card. It'll play games exceptionally well at 1440p. And then the stuttering, if you're playing AAA titles, you'll have a great time on this graphics card. So for me, honestly, though, if you guys are asking me for a personal recommendation, having experienced what I've experienced with AMD ATI graphics cards versus NVIDIA graphics cards, I recommend paying the premium for the NVIDIA graphics card, as I always do now. I don't even bother with AMD graphics cards, but I want to bother. If you guys have watched me for a while, I want to give AMD a chance all the time. I love the fact that there's competition out there, and these guys are trying to give you guys good value for money. It's just like there's just these issues that seem to never go away with an AMD graphics card, and it just makes me wonder, like, AMD, just come clean. Don't try any trickery or anything like that, and try and work on your drivers a bit more, because, I don't know. Anyway. So all in all, you guys can take it as you will out of this review. Look, I'm going to make a separate video comparing this to the GTX 970, and as the end of this video, I'm going to also run a heap of new games as well. So I'm going to be running Warlords of Draenor, a new World of Warcraft game. I'm going to be running Watch Dogs. I'm going to be running Shadows of Mordor, and Advanced Warfare. So there's some new titles in there that will get stressed. I'm dropping Skyrim, and I dropped it in this video as it's pretty much just a CPU-bound game, even at 1440p. And also I am dropping Arma 3 as well, because that's pretty much CPU-bound, because I want to be testing 1440p. I'll also still be doing 1080p for when we get through those real low to mid-range budget cards. But for what it's worth, this is a 1440p card. It does get a recommendation at around $250 USD if you can pick it up for that. But, is it the GTX 970 killer? I don't think so, because there's some issues that I pointed out in this video. But anyway, guys, if you enjoyed this review, if you have any questions, which I'm probably sure you will, then please drop a comment in the comment section below and we can discuss things. As always, I love discussing this with you guys. And if you haven't already subscribed to Tech Yes City, where you guys get the truth, and you always will get the truth. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this review, and peace out for now. Bye.